In a small, quiet village nestled between towering mountains and winding rivers, there lived a man who was known simply as the Stonecutter. His true name was hardly remembered by anyone, but his work was celebrated and revered throughout the region. Day in and day out, from the first light of dawn until the stars emerged in the night sky, he worked tirelessly, shaping raw blocks of stone into pieces that would eventually form parts of grand houses, sturdy bridges, and towering statues. His hands were rough and calloused, his back bent from years of chiseling stone. The Stonecutter led a modest life. His home was a simple cottage on the edge of the village, surrounded by a small garden where he grew vegetables. Each morning, he would rise before the sun, gather his tools, and set out on the winding mountain path to the quarry. Over the years, the mountain had become his silent companion, a towering presence that seemed to offer him quiet strength and steadfastness. At the quarry, he would start his day's work with a rhythm that had become almost second nature to him. The sound of his hammer striking the chisel and the steady fall of stone chips to the ground created a soothing cadence that marked his daily routine. For many years, this life had been fulfilling for the Stonecutter. There was a deep sense of peace in the repetitive nature of his work, in the solitude of the mountains, and in the quiet satisfaction of crafting something from raw material. The villagers admired his skill and often sought him out whenever they needed something made of stone. Yet, as the years passed, a sense of restlessness began to grow within him. The endless cycle of labor started to feel monotonous, and he began to wonder if there was more to life than his seemingly endless toil. One sweltering summer day, as he labored over a particularly stubborn block of granite, the Stonecutter paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. He looked down at the village below, and his gaze was drawn to the large house of the village merchant. The merchant was a wealthy man, renowned for his opulent lifestyle. His house was the grandest in the village, with intricately carved wooden walls, a sprawling garden filled with exotic flowers, and a wealth of luxury that stood in stark contrast to the Stonecutter's humble home. The Stonecutter had passed by the merchant's house countless times on his way to the quarry, but today, something about it caught his eye in a new way. As he watched, the merchant emerged from his mansion, dressed in fine silk and gold garments. He climbed into a beautifully decorated carriage, and his servants attended to him with fanned air and cool drinks as he prepared to travel to the city. A pang of envy struck the Stonecutter. Although he had never yearned for excessive wealth, seeing the ease and comfort with which the merchant lived stirred a deep desire within him. If only I could be a rich man, he thought wistfully, then I wouldn't have to labor under the scorching sun, day after day. At that very moment, as if the universe had heard his unspoken wish, a strange and powerful voice echoed within him. It was not a voice heard with the ears but felt within the heart. "Your wish is granted," the voice said, soft yet undeniable. Before the Stonecutter could react, the world around him seemed to blur and shift. His hammer and chisel fell from his hands, and when he looked down, he saw that he was no longer clad in his simple, weathered clothes. Instead, he was dressed in opulent robes of silk, and rings glittered on his fingers. He was no longer standing on the rocky mountainside but seated in the lavish courtyard of a grand mansion. He blinked in disbelief, trying to process the sudden transformation. I am the merchant," he exclaimed, his voice filled with astonishment and awe. Indeed, the Stonecutter had become the wealthiest merchant in the village. He now had servants at his command, a grand house, and every comfort he had once only dreamed of. For a time, he reveled in his newfound life. He no longer had to endure the heat and toil of chiseling stone. Instead, he spent his days in leisure, enjoying fine food, hosting extravagant parties, and traveling to distant cities in luxurious carriages. But as weeks turned into months, the initial thrill of wealth and luxury began to wane. The novelty of his new lifestyle wore off. And he began to notice things he had not considered before. Despite his riches, he was not free from the burdens of life. There were always business matters to manage, disputes with other merchants to resolve, and the constant anxiety of preserving his fortune. One particularly sweltering summer day, the merchant, once the Stonecutter, sat in the shade of his garden, observing his servants laboring in the sun. Despite having everything he had once coveted, he felt a strange emptiness inside. The sun beat down relentlessly, and even in the shade, he felt its oppressive heat. As he sat there, fanning himself with a handkerchief, he saw a procession making its way through the village streets. It was the king, the ruler of the land, carried on a grand litter by his soldiers. The villagers bowed deeply as the king passed by, his face serene and unaffected by the heat. He wore a magnificent golden crown, and his garments were even more splendid than the merchant's. The merchant watched with growing envy. The king, he thought, is truly the most powerful man. Even the richest merchant must bow before him. He commands armies, passes laws, and rules over all the land. If only I could be the king, then I would have true power. Once again, the strange, silent voice echoed in his heart. Your wish is granted. In an instant, the merchant turned stonecutter found himself transformed once more. He was no longer seated in his luxurious courtyard but was now atop a grand throne, draped in royal robes and wearing a resplendent golden crown. Around him, ministers and generals bowed low, awaiting his commands. I am the king. He proclaimed, his voice brimming with the awe of his new position. As king, the Stonecutter now ruler commanded armies, passed laws, and lived in a palace of unparalleled grandeur. His authority was absolute, and people bowed before him, acknowledging his supreme power. For a time, he reveled in his newfound authority, savoring the control he had over his subjects and the privileges that came with his position. But even the life of a king began to lose its luster as days went by. Despite his power and influence, he found himself still subject to forces beyond his control. One day, while riding through the countryside, he noticed the sun blazing fiercely in the sky, its heat penetrating even the royal carriage. He tried to shield himself from the scorching rays, but there was no escaping the sun's relentless power. He realized that, despite his wealth and authority, he could not command the sun. The sun, he thought with frustration, is more powerful than any king. It shines upon all, rich or poor, ruler or servant. If only I could be the sun, then I would truly be the most powerful force in the world. Once again, the mysterious voice granted his wish. Your wish is granted. In the blink of an eye, the stonecutter turned merchant turned king found himself transformed yet again. He was no longer bound by earthly concerns or the limitations of a human body. He had become the sun, blazing brilliantly in the sky, casting his light and warmth upon the earth. He felt immense power, knowing that all life depended on him. The plants grew, the rivers flowed, and the people thrived because of his light. For a time, the stonecutter now sun was content. He reveled in the unparalleled power of his position, shining down with pride. But as days passed, he began to notice something troubling. Clouds began to gather in the sky, obscuring his light and casting shadows over the land below. No matter how fiercely he burned, the clouds would block his radiance, preventing him from reaching the earth. The clouds, he thought in frustration, are stronger than the sun. They can obscure my light and control the sky. If only I could be a cloud, then I would be the most powerful force of all. As before, the voice responded. Your wish is granted. Now, the stonecutter had become a vast, dark cloud. He floated high in the sky, covering the sun and bringing rain and storms to the land below. He reveled in his new power, watching as rivers swelled and villages were inundated. He could control the weather, and with it, the fates of those below. The sense of dominance filled him with satisfaction, but even as a cloud, the stonecutter's desire for power remained unfulfilled. One day, as he drifted across the sky, he came upon a great mountain. The mountain stood tall and unyielding, unaffected by the storm's rage. No matter how fiercely he raged or how much rain he poured, the mountain remained steadfast, its rocky slopes unshaken by the fury of the clouds. The mountain, the stonecutter realized, is mightier than the clouds. It is immovable and eternal. If only I could be the mountain, then I would be the most powerful being in the world. Once more, the familiar voice granted his wish. Your wish is granted. In an instant, the Stonecutter became the mountain. He stood tall and proud, a colossal presence that soared above the earth, feeling the strength of his rocky body anchored deep in the ground. The wind howled, and the rain fell, but he remained unmoved, an eternal presence that would endure for ages to come. For a time, the Stonecutter turned mountain was content. He felt invincible, knowing that nothing could harm or shift him. But as days passed, he began to feel an odd sensation, a rhythmic tapping at his base, persistent and unrelenting. Looking down, he saw a familiar figure. It was a Stonecutter, hammering away at the rocks at his feet, shaping them into stones for construction. Despite the mountain's immense size and power, the Stonecutter's small, persistent efforts were slowly but surely chipping away at him. In that moment, the Stonecutter now mountain realized the truth. The power he had sought in wealth, authority, and even in the forces of nature was not what he truly needed. All along, the strength he desired was within him as the humble Stonecutter. The ability to shape and transform the world came not from being the mightiest force, but from the quiet, patient persistence of his own hands and heart. With a newfound sense of peace, the Stonecutter wished to return to his old life, and so, he found himself once again standing on the mountainside, chisel in hand, the familiar weight of the hammer in his grip. But this time, he smiled. He no longer desired to be anyone or anything else. He was content to be the Stonecutter, shaping the world in his own way, one small, steady stroke at a time. His heart was full, and his spirit was at peace, knowing that his true strength lay in the simple and enduring aspects of his life. The moral of the story is, true contentment and fulfillment come from embracing and appreciating one's own life and abilities. Seeking happiness through external wealth, power, or status often leads to dissatisfaction. Inner peace is found by recognizing the value in one's own unique role and circumstances.